Before there were pharaohs, before pyramids, before even the idea of Egypt as a unified land, there was only the Nile cutting through silence and desert like a lifeline through emptiness. This river did not simply pass through the land, it defined it. It carved out the boundaries of survival itself. Every year, it flooded with a precision that must have felt almost supernatural to early human observers, transforming barren desert into fertile black earth in a matter of days. And in that transformation, life did not just continue, it multiplied. Human groups that once moved constantly in search of food began to settle along its banks. At first, these settlements were small and fragile, dependent entirely on the river's rhythm. But over time, something profound began to change. Survival gave way to permanence, and permanence gave rise to civilization. These early communities were not Egypt yet. They were scattered societies learning, slowly and unevenly, how to live together in a landscape that demanded cooperation. Villages formed along the river's edge, each one shaped by the Nile's cycle of flood and retreat. And although they were separated by distance and identity, they were all bound by the same reality: without the Nile, nothing survived. Archaeological evidence suggests that before written history, the Nile Valley was already home to complex societies adapting to dramatic environmental change. As the Sahara gradually dried out and transformed into desert, populations were forced inward toward the river. This migration compressed diverse groups into a narrow, fertile corridor, intensifying interaction, competition, and cultural exchange. And when human populations are compressed into limited space over long periods of time, something predictable happens. They begin to organize. At first, that organization was local. Small kin-based groups controlled sections of land along the river, managing irrigation and seasonal farming. Leadership was informal but necessary. Whoever could coordinate labor and manage resources held influence. Power was not yet institutionalized, but it was already beginning to concentrate. This concentration of authority is one of the earliest signs of what would eventually become the Egyptian state. Because the Nile demanded coordination, flood cycles had to be understood and anticipated. Water distribution had to be managed across growing populations. Agriculture required timing, cooperation, and shared effort. And slowly, leadership structures began to harden into something more permanent. Alongside this economic and environmental transformation, cultural and spiritual ideas were also evolving. Early Egyptians developed a worldview deeply tied to natural cycles. The Nile itself was not just a river, it was existence. Its flooding symbolized renewal, its retreat symbolized death, and its return symbolized rebirth. Over time, this cycle became the foundation of religious thought, shaping beliefs about life, death, and continuity. Even burial practices from this early period reveal a growing spiritual complexity. The dead were carefully arranged, often buried with food, tools, and symbolic objects. This suggests a belief in some form of continuation beyond death, an early concept of an afterlife that would later become central to Egyptian civilization. And as centuries passed, these scattered communities began to connect more frequently. Trade along the Nile intensified. Cultural practices began to overlap. Artistic styles slowly standardized across regions. What had once been isolated villages began to form a shared cultural continuum, even if they did not yet see themselves as one people. But unity had not yet arrived. Egypt at this stage was still divided into two broad regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. These were not political states in the later sense, but deeply rooted cultural and geographic zones shaped by environment and trade patterns. Upper Egypt was narrow, arid, and tightly bound to the Nile's predictable flow. This created conditions for stronger central coordination within communities. Lower Egypt, in contrast, spread across the Nile Delta, wetter, more complex, and more open to external influence. This made it more fragmented and less centralized. This division would become one of the most important structural tensions in early Egyptian history. Because civilizations do not begin unified, they begin divided, and only later are forced into unity by pressure. That pressure came gradually. Population growth increased competition for land and water. Agriculture required larger coordinated systems. Trade demanded stability. And over time, the idea of unification began to form not as ambition, but as necessity. Even early symbolic systems began to reflect this duality. The imagery of Upper and Lower Egypt would later become central to royal ideology, representing balance, order, and cosmic harmony. But even before kings existed, the idea of unity through duality was already taking shape in the cultural imagination. By the end of this formative era, something irreversible had begun. Human beings were no longer just living along the Nile, they were shaping it, organizing it, depending on it in ways that required cooperation beyond anything seen before in the region. And in that slow, uneven process of adaptation, the foundation of Egypt was laid. Not yet a kingdom, not yet a state, but a civilization quietly assembling itself from water, soil, and shared necessity. And from this foundation, everything that would become ancient Egypt begins to rise. Before Egypt became a kingdom, it was a landscape of competing cultures slowly learning how to become something more than scattered survival. This period, known as pre-dynastic Egypt, is not defined by kings or dynasties. It is defined by movement. Ideas, people, technologies, and traditions were all shifting along the Nile, slowly building the foundations of a civilization that did not yet know its own name. At first, these societies were small and regional, villages clustered along fertile stretches of riverbank, each one shaped by local conditions and traditions. Life was still deeply dependent on agriculture, hunting, and seasonal cycles, but something fundamental was changing beneath the surface. Populations were growing, and with growth came pressure. That pressure forced interaction. Different communities began to trade more frequently. Pottery styles spread across regions. Burial customs began to show shared patterns. Even artistic expression started to converge, suggesting that cultural boundaries were becoming less rigid over time. What had once been isolated identities was slowly being woven into a broader cultural fabric. One of the most important archaeological windows into this transformation is the Naqada culture, which is divided into Naqada I, and III. These phases do not represent sudden revolutions, but gradual intensification. Society becomes more complex with each stage. Technology improves. Social hierarchy becomes more visible. And political organization begins to take shape in increasingly structured forms. By Naqada II, we begin to see clear signs of elite emergence. Certain individuals and burial sites contain significantly richer grave goods than others. This suggests the development of social stratification, a division between those who control resources and those who produce them. It is not yet a formal state, but the architecture of inequality is already forming. And where hierarchy appears, power is never far behind. Local leaders begin to emerge in key settlements. These figures are not yet pharaohs, but they are no longer simple village heads either. They control trade routes, organize labor, and coordinate agricultural production across wider regions. Their influence is visible in both material culture and burial practices, where status becomes increasingly important. At the same time, Egypt's external connections expand dramatically. Trade networks extend beyond the Nile Valley. To the south lies Nubia, rich in gold and exotic materials. To the northeast lies the Levant, connecting Egypt to broader Near Eastern cultures. Even indirect trade routes bring in obsidian, copper, and luxury goods from distant regions. These connections are not just economic, they are transformative. They expose Egypt to new technologies, new ideas, and new forms of organization. And as external contact increases, internal competition intensifies. Different regions of Egypt begin to develop distinct identities. Upper Egypt, with its narrow valley and strong dependence on the Nile's controlled flow, develops tighter political structures and stronger elite consolidation. Settlements like Hierakonpolis and Naqada become increasingly influential centers of power. Lower Egypt, spread across the Nile Delta, evolves differently. Its landscape is more fragmented, shaped by marshes, waterways, and access to Mediterranean trade routes. This creates a more decentralized structure, with multiple competing centers of influence rather than a single dominant authority. This divergence is crucial because it creates a dual system, two evolving worlds within the same river civilization. And that duality would eventually define the next great turning point in Egyptian history. Even religious thought begins to reflect this emerging complexity. Early spiritual systems show increasing emphasis on order, balance, and cosmic structure. Natural forces like the Nile flood are not just observed, they are interpreted. They are given meaning. Life, death, and renewal become part of a cyclical worldview that ties human existence to the rhythm of nature itself. Burial practices continue to evolve as well. Tombs become more elaborate. Grave goods become more standardized, yet also more hierarchical. The idea of an afterlife becomes increasingly structured, suggesting that spiritual belief is becoming more formalized and socially embedded. By the late pre-dynastic period, Egypt is no longer just a collection of villages. It is a densely interconnected cultural system, increasingly unified in practice, if not yet in political form. And yet, it remains divided. Upper and Lower Egypt continue to develop separately, each refining its own political and cultural systems, but the tension between them is becoming more pronounced. Trade, conflict, and competition all intensify. Leadership structures become stronger, and the idea of unification begins to shift from possibility into inevitability. Because when a civilization becomes sufficiently interconnected, fragmentation becomes unstable. Coordination becomes necessary, and necessity has a way of producing history. By the end of the pre-dynastic period, Egypt is standing on the edge of transformation. The tools of statehood are already in place: hierarchy, trade networks, regional leadership, and shared cultural identity. What remains is the final step, the consolidation of power into a single political structure. And when that moment arrives, Egypt will no longer be a collection of societies along the Nile. It will become a state. At some point in the long silence of prehistory, something irreversible happens. The scattered cultures of the Nile, the competing regions of Upper and Lower Egypt, the emerging leaders and growing networks of power all begin to move toward a single outcome: unification. This was not a peaceful agreement, nor a sudden moment of clarity. It was the result of pressure, political, economic, and geographic, building over generations. As trade expanded and populations grew, fragmentation became a liability. Competing centers of power could no longer exist without constant conflict. Stability required coordination, and coordination required authority. In Upper Egypt, that authority was already taking shape. The southern regions had developed stronger political cohesion, with powerful centers like Hierakonpolis rising to dominance. These were not just settlements, they were early capitals, where leaders commanded resources, organized labor, and projected influence beyond their immediate surroundings. Over time, one of these southern powers began to outgrow the others. And as it grew, it turned north. Lower Egypt, with its fertile delta and complex waterways, was both a prize and a challenge. It was richer in agricultural output and more connected to external trade, but it was also more fragmented. Multiple local authorities competed for influence, creating a landscape that was difficult to control but vulnerable to a more centralized force. Somewhere in this dynamic, conflict escalated. Archaeological evidence, from ceremonial palettes, inscriptions, and symbolic art, suggests that the process of unification involved both warfare and political consolidation. One artifact in particular stands at the center of this transformation: the Nama palette. This object is not just art, it is a statement of power. It depicts a ruler, widely identified as Nama, wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. On one side, he is shown subduing an enemy. On the other, he appears as a unifier, overseeing the integration of two lands into one. Whether this represents a single event or a symbolic culmination of a longer process is still debated, but its meaning is clear. Egypt had become one. Nama, often identified with the legendary Menes, is traditionally credited as the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt. Whether he was truly the first or simply the most successful of several competing rulers matters less than what he represents, the birth of kingship as a national institution. Because with unification, something entirely new emerges. The idea of the pharaoh. This was not just a king in the conventional sense. The pharaoh was both political ruler and divine figure, a living embodiment of order itself. In a world defined by cycles of chaos and renewal, the pharaoh stood as the guarantor of balance, the one who maintained harmony between land, people, and the cosmos. This concept would define Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt also created a symbolic system that would become central to royal identity. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, represented not just political control, but cosmic unity. The two lands were no longer separate, they were bound together under a single order. And that order needed structure. With unification came the beginnings of a centralized state. Administration became more formalized. Record-keeping began to develop into early writing systems, what would later become hieroglyphs. Taxation, labor organization, and resource distribution all required coordination on a scale never before attempted in the Nile Valley. The capital of this new unified state was established at Memphis, strategically located near the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, the pharaoh could oversee both regions, reinforcing the idea that Egypt was now a single entity. But unification did not erase division completely. It transformed it. The identity of Upper and Lower Egypt remained deeply embedded in culture, religion, and symbolism. Rather than disappearing, this duality became part of the system itself. Unity in Egypt was not about eliminating difference, it was about balancing it. This balance would become one of the defining characteristics of Egyptian thought. Order versus chaos. Life versus death. Upper versus lower. All held together through the authority of the pharaoh. And yet, beneath the surface of this new unity, the challenges of scale and coordination remained. Because creating a state is one thing, sustaining it is another. The early rulers of Egypt now faced a new reality. They were no longer leaders of regions, but rulers of a civilization. They had to maintain control over vast agricultural systems, manage growing populations, and ensure that the delicate balance of the Nile's cycle continued to support the entire structure. This required more than power. It required legitimacy. And legitimacy in Egypt would come from a combination of religion, tradition, and visible authority. Monumental architecture would soon begin to emerge, not just as construction, but as proof of control over labor, resources, and the natural world itself. But that transformation was still to come. For now, Egypt stood at the threshold of history. No longer a collection of competing cultures, but a unified state with a single ruler, a shared identity, and a system that would endure for millennia. And with that unification, the first chapter of ancient Egypt truly begins. Unification was not the end of Egypt's transformation. It was the beginning of something far more difficult, the creation of a system that could hold that unity together. Because bringing Upper and Lower Egypt under one ruler was only the first step. The real challenge was turning that victory into permanence, into a structure that could survive beyond a single lifetime, beyond a single ruler, and even beyond moments of crisis. The early dynastic period represents that effort. It is a time when the idea of Egypt is tested, refined, and slowly turned into a functioning state. The first rulers of this new unified land faced a problem no one before them had encountered. They were not just leaders of a region, they were responsible for an entire civilization stretched along hundreds of miles of river. Communication was slow, travel was difficult, and local identities remained strong. Without a system of governance, unity would collapse. So they built one. Administration became the backbone of the early Egyptian state. Officials were appointed to oversee regions, manage resources, and report back to the central authority. These early bureaucrats were not just servants of the king, they were the mechanisms through which the king's power could reach beyond the capital. And for the first time, Egypt begins to resemble a true state. Writing plays a critical role in this transformation. What had once been symbolic markings evolves into a more structured system, early hieroglyphs. At first, writing is used primarily for administration, recording goods, tracking labor, documenting transactions, but even in these early stages, it carries something more. It becomes a tool of permanence, a way to fix authority into the fabric of the state. Because what is written can endure. Alongside administration and writing, religion becomes increasingly formalized. The pharaoh is no longer just a powerful ruler. He is elevated into a divine figure, a living god whose authority is tied to cosmic order. This idea is not imposed suddenly. It grows gradually from earlier beliefs about the connection between nature, leadership, and balance. In Egyptian thought, the universe is governed by a principle known as ma'at, order, harmony, and truth. And the pharaoh becomes its guardian. This concept is essential because it transforms political power into something more than control. It becomes responsibility. The pharaoh is not just ruling Egypt, he is maintaining the balance of existence itself. Floods must come at the right time, crops must grow, society must function in harmony. If these things fail, it is not just a political problem, it is a cosmic one. This fusion of governance and religion gives the Egyptian state a unique stability. Authority is not questioned easily because it is tied to the structure of the universe. At the same time, visible expressions of power begin to take shape. Early monumental architecture appears, not yet the massive pyramids of later periods, but increasingly complex tombs and ceremonial structures. These serve multiple purposes. They honor the dead, reinforce social hierarchy, and demonstrate the ability of the state to organize labor on a large scale. Even in death, power must be displayed. The development of royal tombs at sites like Abydos reflects this growing complexity. These are not simple graves. They are carefully constructed spaces filled with goods, symbolism, and sometimes even human sacrifices, retainers buried alongside the ruler to serve in the afterlife. This practice reveals something profound about early Egyptian society. The boundary between life and death is not a separation, but a continuation. And the pharaoh's authority does not end with death, it extends into eternity. Another important development during this period is the standardization of culture. As the state becomes more centralized, artistic styles, religious practices, and social structures begin to align across regions. What had once been local variations gradually merge into a shared Egyptian identity. This does not erase regional differences, but it creates a framework in which they coexist within a larger system. Unity becomes not just political, but cultural. Trade also continues to expand. Egypt strengthens connections with neighboring regions, importing materials that are not available locally, wood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, stone from distant quarries. These trade networks reinforce the state's ability to accumulate wealth and project influence beyond its borders. And yet, despite all this progress, the system is still fragile, because it depends heavily on the strength of the ruler. The institutions of the state are still developing. Bureaucracy exists, but it is not yet fully independent. Local officials are loyal, but their loyalty is tied to the authority of the pharaoh. If that authority weakens, the entire system risks fragmentation. This tension defines the early dynastic period. It is a time of construction, not just of buildings, but of ideas, systems, and identities. The foundations of Egyptian civilization are being laid piece by piece. Writing, administration, religion, centralized authority, all coming together to form a structure that can sustain unity over time. And as these foundations strengthen, they prepare Egypt for its next great transformation. Because the system that is being built here will soon reach a level of scale and ambition never seen before. A scale that will produce monuments so vast that they will define Egypt in the imagination of the world for thousands of years. The age of the pyramids is coming. The foundations have been laid. Administration exists. Religion is formalized. The pharaoh stands not just as ruler, but as a living symbol of cosmic order. Egypt is no longer an experiment in unity, it is a functioning state. And now it begins to expand its ambition. The Old Kingdom marks the moment when Egypt transitions from stability into scale. What was once fragile becomes confident. What was once developing becomes refined. And what was once limited begins to reach for permanence. This is the age where Egypt decides not only to exist, but to endure. At the center of this transformation is the strengthening of kingship. The pharaoh is no longer just divine in concept. His authority becomes absolute in practice. He commands labor, controls resources, and directs the entire administrative system of the state. But this authority is not expressed through constant warfare or expansion. Instead, it is expressed through something far more lasting. Monumental construction. The earliest and most important breakthrough comes under the reign of King Djoser. Until this point, royal tombs had been relatively modest structures known as mastabas, rectangular, flat-roofed buildings made of mud brick. But under Djoser, something entirely new is attempted. A tomb that reaches upward. Designed by his architect Imhotep, the step pyramid at Saqqara becomes the first large-scale stone structure in human history. It is not just a tomb, it is a statement that the pharaoh's power extends beyond life, beyond death, and into eternity. Stone replaces mud brick, scale replaces modesty, permanence replaces decay. And with this single innovation, Egypt changes forever. Because once the idea of building in stone takes hold, there is no turning back. The state now has both the vision and the capability to undertake projects of extraordinary scale. This requires coordination on a level never before seen. Tens of thousands of workers must be organized, supplied, and directed. Quarries must be managed. Transport systems must be maintained. Food production must support not just local populations, but massive labor forces. This is not chaos. It is controlled complexity. And it reveals something crucial about the Old Kingdom. These monuments are not built by slaves in chains, but by a highly organized society capable of mobilizing its population in structured seasonal labor systems. Farmers, during the flood season when fields are submerged, are redirected into state projects. Labor becomes part of the social contract. The pharaoh provides order and prosperity. The people provide effort and loyalty. This system works for a time. As dynasties progress, the scale of ambition grows even further. Under the Fourth Dynasty, pyramid construction reaches its peak. Pharaohs like Khufu, Kaffa, and Menkaure push the limits of engineering, organization, and human effort. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza stands as the ultimate expression of this ambition. It is not just large, it is precise. Its alignment with the cardinal directions, its geometric perfection, and its sheer scale suggest a level of planning and execution that continues to astonish even in the modern world. But the pyramid is only the visible result. Behind it lies an entire system: quarries, labor camps, administrative records, supply chains, and logistical networks, all functioning together in harmony. This is what the Old Kingdom truly represents. A civilization operating at full capacity. Religion during this period becomes even more tightly connected to kingship. The pharaoh is not simply associated with the gods, he is considered a god, specifically linked to the sun god Ra. His journey after death is believed to involve ascending to the heavens, joining the divine order, and continuing to maintain cosmic balance. The pyramid itself becomes part of this belief system. Its shape, rising toward the sky, symbolizes the pharaoh's ascent. Its internal chambers are designed as gateways between worlds, and its permanence ensures that the pharaoh's legacy and authority will endure beyond time. But such a system is not without cost. The concentration of power and resources required to build these monuments places immense strain on the state. Wealth flows toward the center. Labor is constantly mobilized, and local authorities, while still part of the system, begin to accumulate power of their own. This is where the first cracks begin to appear. Because as the state expands its ambition, it also expands its dependence on perfect coordination. Any disruption, economic, environmental, or political, has the potential to ripple across the entire system. And over time, those disruptions begin to emerge. Climate fluctuations may have reduced the reliability of Nile floods. Agricultural output becomes less predictable. As resources tighten, the ability of the central authority to maintain control weakens. At the same time, provincial governors, known as nomarchs, grow increasingly powerful within their regions. The balance begins to shift. Authority, once concentrated in the pharaoh, starts to diffuse outward. And as it does, the unity that defined the Old Kingdom begins to unravel. But this collapse is not immediate. For generations, the system holds. Monuments continue to rise. The illusion of permanence remains intact, but beneath the surface, the structure is changing. Because no system, no matter how grand, can sustain itself indefinitely without adaptation. And the Old Kingdom, for all its brilliance, is approaching its limits. The pyramids will remain standing as symbols of a civilization at its height. But the system that built them is beginning to fracture. And from that fracture, a new phase of Egyptian history will emerge. One defined not by unity and scale, but by division and survival. At its height, the Old Kingdom does not merely function. It dominates. The machinery of the state operates with a confidence that borders on inevitability. The Nile continues its cycles. The administration continues its work. The pharaoh continues to command both the living and the symbolic world. And across the desert plateau west of the river, something rises that will outlast everything else. Stone shaped into eternity. The age of the pyramids is not just about construction. It is about belief made visible. It is about a civilization expressing its understanding of life, death, and cosmic order through architecture on a scale never seen before. And at the center of this expression stands one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history, the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Constructed during the 4th dynasty, this structure is not simply large, it is almost incomprehensibly precise. Millions of stone blocks, each weighing several tons, are cut, transporting, and assembled with a level of accuracy that continues to challenge modern explanation. Its alignment with the cardinal directions is nearly perfect. Its internal chambers are arranged with deliberate purpose. Every element reflects planning, coordination, and execution at the highest level. But the pyramid itself is only the visible peak of a much larger system. To build something like this requires more than labor. It requires organization. Workers must be housed, fed, and rotated. Tools must be produced and maintained. Stone must be quarried, transporting across distances and lifted into place. Records must be kept. Decisions must be made continuously at every level. This is not chaos driven by force. It is structure driven by design. The labor force behind the pyramids is often misunderstood. These were not enslaved masses dragged into service. Archaeological evidence suggests a more complex system, a workforce made up of skilled laborers, seasonal workers, craftsmen, and administrators. Many were farmers who worked on state projects during the Nile flood season when agriculture temporarily paused. They were part of the system, and the system relied on them. Entire communities formed around pyramid construction sites. Workers lived in organized settlements, received rations, and operated within a highly structured environment. There was hierarchy even within labor, supervisors, foremen, and specialized craftsmen, all contributing to the final structure. The pyramid, in this sense, becomes a reflection of Egyptian society itself. Layered, ordered, interconnected. And at the top of that structure stands the pharaoh. But the pyramid is not just about power, it is about belief. Egyptian religion during this period reaches a level of clarity and integration that defines the entire civilization. The pharaoh is closely associated with Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky becomes a central metaphor for existence. Life is a cycle. Death is not an end, but a transition. The pyramid embodies this idea. Its form rises toward the sky, symbolizing ascent. Its internal chambers represent passage into the afterlife. Its permanence ensures that the pharaoh's journey continues without interruption. Surrounding structures, temples, causeways, and smaller tombs create a complete ritual landscape where the living and the dead remain connected. This is not just architecture. It is a worldview in stone. And as this worldview solidifies, it spreads across society. Elite tombs become more elaborate, art becomes more standardized, writing becomes more refined. The concept of ma'at, order and balance, is reinforced at every level of life. Egypt, during this period, is not experimenting, it is defining itself. But even at its peak, the system contains its own limitations. Because the very scale that defines the age of the pyramids also creates strain. Resources are finite. Labor, while organized, is still drawn from a population that must also sustain agriculture and daily life. The concentration of wealth and effort into monumental projects means that less is available for flexibility, for adaptation, for responding to change. And change begins to come. Later rulers attempt to replicate the achievements of their predecessors, but the results become less consistent. Pyramids are built more quickly, sometimes with lower quality materials. The focus shifts from innovation to repetition. This is often the first sign of systemic fatigue. At the same time, power begins to decentralize. Regional governors, or nomarchs, gain influence as the state relies on them to manage local affairs. Their authority grows, sometimes independently of the central government. Over time, loyalty becomes more localized, less tied directly to the pharaoh. The balance begins to shift subtly. And then, the environment itself introduces uncertainty. There is evidence that Nile flood patterns become less predictable toward the end of the Old Kingdom. Even small changes in flood levels can have significant consequences for agriculture. Reduced harvests mean less surplus. Less surplus means less ability to sustain large-scale projects and centralized control. The system, once perfectly balanced, begins to lose its stability. But this is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual erosion. The pyramids still stand, the rituals continue, the administration functions, but beneath the surface, the connections that hold everything together are weakening. Because no system, no matter how refined, can remain static in the face of changing conditions. And the Old Kingdom, for all its achievements, is built on the assumption of continuity, of stable floods, stable authority, stable belief. When those assumptions begin to falter, so does the structure built upon them. The age of the pyramids represents the highest expression of early Egyptian civilization. But it also marks the point where that expression reaches its limits. What follows will not be a continuation of this stability. It will be something very different. A period where unity breaks apart, where authority fragments, and where survival once again becomes uncertain. The stones will remain silent and unchanging. But the world that built them is beginning to shift. For generations, Egypt had known stability. The Nile flooded, crops grew, the pharaoh ruled, the system worked. But no system remains untouched forever. At first, the changes are subtle. A slightly lower flood one year, a delayed cycle the next. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. But in a civilization so deeply tied to the rhythms of the Nile, even small disruptions begin to ripple outward. Agriculture weakens. Surplus declines. And with less surplus, everything else begins to strain. The Old Kingdom had been built on abundance, the ability to mobilize labor, construct monuments, and sustain a centralized administration across vast distances. But that abundance depended on consistency. When the Nile's behavior became less predictable, the foundation of the system began to erode. And as resources tightened, authority weakened. The pharaoh, once seen as the guarantor of cosmic order, now faced a problem that could not be easily controlled. If floods failed, if crops suffered, if famine threatened, it was not just a practical crisis. It was a crisis of belief. Because if the pharaoh maintained Ma'at, how could disorder exist? This question does not appear in written rebellion or open challenge at first. It appears in silence, in doubt, in the slow unraveling of certainty. At the same time, the structure of power begins to shift. Regional governors, the nomarchs, who had once served the central administration, begin to assert more independence. As the central government struggles to maintain control, these local leaders take on greater responsibility within their regions. They control resources. They organize labor. They provide stability where the center cannot. And over time, their loyalty begins to shift. From the pharaoh to themselves. This is how centralization begins to break. Not through sudden collapse, but through gradual redistribution of power. The state does not disappear overnight. It weakens unevenly. Some regions remain stable, others fragment. Communication between the center and the periphery becomes less reliable. Authority becomes localized. And with localization comes division. The monumental building projects that once defined the Old Kingdom begin to slow. Resources are no longer available at the same scale. Labor is harder to organize. The grand pyramids give way to smaller, less ambitious constructions. The illusion of permanence begins to fade. But perhaps the most profound change is not economic or political. It is psychological. For centuries, Egyptians had believed in a system where order was guaranteed, where the pharaoh maintained balance between the natural and divine worlds. But now, that certainty begins to fracture. If the floods fail, if famine spreads, if authority weakens, then perhaps the system is not as absolute as it once seemed. This shift in perception is subtle, but it is powerful. Because belief is what holds a system together when material conditions begin to fail. And when belief weakens, everything else follows. The collapse of the Old Kingdom does not come as a single event. There is no moment where Egypt simply falls. Instead, it dissolves. Gradually, the centralized state gives way to a patchwork of regional powers. The authority of the pharaoh becomes more symbolic than real. Local rulers govern their territories with increasing autonomy. This is the beginning of the first intermediate period, a time often described as chaotic, fragmented, and uncertain. But that description only captures part of the truth. Because while central authority collapses, local life continues. In many regions, communities adapt. Agriculture persists. Trade continues, though on a smaller scale. Culture does not disappear, it transforms. Without the dominance of a single centralized system, regional variation becomes more visible again. In a way, Egypt returns to something closer to its earlier state. But it is not the same. Because now, it carries the memory of unity. The idea of a single Egypt does not vanish with the collapse of the Old Kingdom. It remains as a possibility, as an expectation, as something that can be restored. And that idea is powerful, because once a civilization has experienced unity, it becomes difficult to accept permanent division. So even as Egypt fragments, the seeds of reunification are already present. Different regional rulers begin to compete not just for control of their territories, but for the authority to restore the whole. And from that competition, a new phase of history begins to take shape. One defined not by the certainty of centralized power, but by the struggle to rebuild it. The pyramids still stand, silent reminders of what Egypt once was. But the system that created them has collapsed. And in its place, a new and uncertain world begins. When the Old Kingdom fades, Egypt does not fall into silence. It fractures. The centralized authority that once held the Nile Valley together dissolves into a landscape of regional powers. The pharaoh still exists in name, but the reality of control has shifted. Power now lies in the hands of local rulers, nomarchs who govern their territories with increasing independence. This is the first intermediate period, often described as an age of chaos, but the truth is more complex. Because while unity disappears, life continues. The Nile still floods, though less reliably, farmers still plant and harvest, trade still moves along the river, though on a smaller scale, temples remain active, culture does not collapse, it decentralizes. What changes is not existence, but structure. Instead of one dominant center, Egypt becomes a network of competing regions. Two major power blocks begin to emerge, one based in Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and another in Thebes in Upper Egypt. Each claims legitimacy. Each presents itself as the rightful continuation of Egyptian kingship. But neither is strong enough to dominate the other, at least not yet. This creates a prolonged period of tension. Not constant warfare, but ongoing rivalry. Borders shift, alliances form and break, authority is negotiated rather than imposed, and across this fragmented landscape, the idea of Egypt as a single unified state lingers but remains out of reach. Yet something important begins to happen during this period. Without the overwhelming dominance of a centralized monarchy, regional cultures begin to express themselves more freely. Art becomes more varied, local traditions gain prominence, even burial practices evolve, reflecting a broader range of beliefs and identities. This is not simply decline. It is transformation. One of the most significant developments is the changing nature of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, the afterlife was largely reserved for the pharaoh. His journey beyond death was central to religious belief, while ordinary people had a more limited spiritual role. But during the first intermediate period, this idea begins to shift. Access to the afterlife becomes more democratized. Texts, symbols, and burial practices that were once exclusive to royalty begin to appear in non-royal tombs. The concept of eternal life expands beyond the king to include nobles and eventually common people. This is a profound change, because it reshapes the relationship between individuals and the divine. Religion becomes less centralized, more personal. And that shift will have lasting effects on Egyptian culture. At the same time, literature begins to emerge in new forms. Texts from this period reflect uncertainty, questioning, and reflection. There is a sense that the old order has broken, and people are trying to understand why. These writings are not purely religious or administrative, they are philosophical. They ask questions about justice, order, and the nature of society. And in doing so, they reveal a civilization thinking about itself. But despite these cultural developments, the political reality remains unstable. The division between Heracleopolis and Thebes continues to define the era. Each center builds its own administrative system, its own network of loyalty, its own claim to legitimacy. Neither can fully unify the country, but both are preparing for that possibility. And over time, one begins to gain the advantage. The Theban rulers of Upper Egypt gradually consolidate their power. They expand their influence southward and begin pushing north. Their leadership becomes more organized, more strategic. They are not just defending their territory, they are building a base for reunification. This process is slow, measured not in years, but in generations. But eventually, it reaches a tipping point. Under the leadership of Mentuhotep II, Thebes moves decisively against its northern rival. The conflict culminates in the defeat of the Heracleopolitan rulers and the reunification of Egypt under a single authority once again. After a period of fragmentation, Egypt is whole. But it is not the same Egypt that existed before. The memory of collapse has changed it. The experience of division has reshaped its institutions, its culture, and its understanding of power. The new rulers do not simply restore the old kingdom, they build something different, informed by the lessons of what came before. Because the first intermediate period is not just a break in history. It is a transition, a moment where the old system falls and a new one begins to take shape in its place. And from that transition, Egypt enters a new era. One defined not just by unity, but by renewal. Out of fragmentation, a new Egypt emerges. Not the same as before, not a simple restoration of what was lost, but something reshaped by experience. The reunification under Mentuhotep II does more than end division. It forces a reconsideration of how the state should function, how power should be distributed, and how stability can be maintained. Because the memory of collapse is still fresh. And this time, Egypt adapts. The Middle Kingdom begins with a renewed emphasis on balance, not just cosmic balance through Ma'at, but political balance between central authority and regional power. The rulers of this era understand that over-centralization had strained the Old Kingdom, while fragmentation had weakened the first intermediate period. So they build a system that attempts to manage both. The capital shifts, administrative systems are reorganized, and a more flexible structure of governance begins to take shape. Nomarchs are still present, but their power is more carefully controlled. The state reasserts authority, but with greater awareness of the risks of imbalance. This is not just recovery. It is refinement. Under rulers like Mentuhotep II and later Amenemhat I, Egypt begins to stabilize and expand again. The Nile's rhythms return to a more predictable pattern, restoring agricultural confidence. Surplus grows, trade networks revive, and once again, the state has the resources to project power beyond its core territory. But the nature of that power has changed. The pharaoh is still central, still divine, but less distant. There is a growing sense that the ruler is not only a god-king, but also a caretaker of the people. This shift is subtle, but it appears in literature, in art, and in administrative tone. Kingship becomes more human, without losing its divine authority. This dual identity strengthens legitimacy. Because a ruler who is both divine and responsive can maintain order more effectively than one who is distant and absolute. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom becomes one of Egypt's most creative and introspective periods. Literature flourishes. Texts such as the Tale of Sinew and the Instructions of Amenemhat reflect a society that is not just stable, but thoughtful. These writings explore themes of loyalty, identity, mortality, and governance. They reveal a civilization that has experienced instability and is now trying to understand it. This is not just storytelling. It is reflection. Art also evolves during this period. While still maintaining traditional forms, it becomes more expressive, more detailed, and sometimes more realistic. There is a greater emphasis on individual identity, even within the rigid structures of Egyptian style. Religion continues to develop as well. The democratization of the afterlife that began in the first intermediate period becomes more fully integrated into society. The coffin texts, spells, and inscriptions designed to guide the dead spread beyond royalty to the broader elite. The idea that eternal life is accessible to more people becomes normalized. This is a continuation of a major shift, because it expands the spiritual framework of the civilization. No longer is the afterlife the exclusive domain of the pharaoh. It becomes a shared destination structured by moral order and ritual knowledge. At the same time, the state begins to focus more actively on defense and expansion. Fortifications are built along Egypt's borders, particularly in Nubia to the south. These are not just military outposts, they are administrative centers, controlling trade routes and securing access to valuable resources like gold. Egypt is no longer just looking inward. It is projecting outward. Trade with the Levant and other neighboring regions intensifies. Diplomatic relationships develop. Egypt becomes more integrated into a wider world, both economically and politically. But with expansion comes new challenges. Maintaining control over distant territories requires strong administration, reliable communication, and consistent leadership. The system must remain balanced. Too much expansion risks overextension, too little risks stagnation. This tension becomes one of the defining features of the Middle Kingdom. And for a time, the balance holds. The 12th dynasty, in particular, represents a high point of stability and efficiency. Rulers like Senusret III strengthen central authority, reduce the power of regional elites, and reinforce the administrative structure of the Arabic Caliph, Arabic Lam, Arabic Dal, Arabic Wau, Arabic Lam, Arabic Tetmabuta. Egypt becomes more unified, more controlled, and more capable of managing its internal and external affairs. But as always, stability is not permanent. Toward the later Middle Kingdom, signs of strain begin to appear, leadership weakens, external pressures increase, and once again, the system begins to lose cohesion. This time, the challenge will not come solely from within. It will come from outside. Because beyond Egypt's borders, new forces are rising. And they are bringing with them technologies, strategies, and ambitions that Egypt has never faced before. The next transformation will not be gradual. It will arrive with speed and with impact. And Egypt will have to respond or be reshaped by it. Stability changes a civilization. It allows it to think beyond survival, beyond recovery, and toward projection. By the height of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt is no longer rebuilding, it is expanding. The lessons of fragmentation have been absorbed, the administration is more controlled, the balance between center and region is better managed, and for the first time since the Old Kingdom, the state begins to look outward with confidence. But this expansion is not reckless. It is strategic. The rulers of the Middle Kingdom understand that geography is both Egypt's strength and its vulnerability. The Nile provides life, but it also creates a narrow corridor that can be threatened from multiple directions. To secure the future, Egypt must control not just its core territory, but its borders. Nowhere is this more evident than in Nubia. To the south, Nubia is rich in resources, especially gold, which is essential for wealth, trade, and symbolic power. But Nubia is not empty land. It is home to its own societies, its own networks, its own power structures. Expansion into this region is not simply occupation, it is integration and control. Under rulers like Senusret III, Egypt constructs a series of massive fortresses along the Nile in Nubia. These are not temporary outposts. They are permanent structures designed to project authority, regulate trade, and monitor movement. They function as both military defenses and administrative centers. From these fortresses, Egypt extends its reach. Trade routes are secured, resources are extracted, Local populations are brought into the Egyptian system, sometimes through cooperation, sometimes through force. Over time, Nubia becomes deeply connected to the Egyptian state, both economically and culturally. This is empire in its early form, not yet vast or global, but deliberate and controlled. At the same time, Egypt strengthens its presence in the northeast, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant. These regions are crucial for access to copper, turquoise, and trade connections with other civilizations. Expeditions are organized, routes are secured, diplomatic relationships begin to form. Egypt is no longer isolated. It is part of a wider network of interaction. And with that interaction comes exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas and technologies. Egypt begins to encounter new forms of warfare, new materials, and new cultural influences. These do not immediately transform Egyptian society, but they introduce variables that will become important later. Internally, the expansion requires a high level of coordination. Administration becomes more sophisticated, records are more detailed, officials are more specialized. The state must manage not just internal resources, but external territories. Communication networks must function efficiently across greater distances. This is a test of the system, and for a time, it succeeds. The 12th dynasty represents the peak of this expansion and control. The rulers are capable, organized, and aware of the importance of balance. They maintain authority without allowing regional power to grow unchecked. They expand without overextending. They build infrastructure that supports both economy and defense. But beneath this success, pressure begins to build. Because expansion increases complexity. The more territory the state controls, the more difficult it becomes to manage. Supply lines stretch, communication slows, local conditions vary, and the system must constantly adjust to maintain stability. At the same time, external influences begin to increase. As trade expands, more foreign groups come into contact with Egypt. Some settle within its borders, particularly in the Nile Delta. At first, these groups are integrated peacefully, contributing to the economy and society. But over time, their presence introduces new dynamics. Egypt is becoming more connected, but also more exposed. And then leadership begins to weaken. After the strong rulers of the 12th dynasty, the central authority becomes less stable. Succession becomes less clear. The ability of the state to maintain its complex system begins to decline. The balance that defined the Middle Kingdom starts to shift. Not dramatically, not immediately, but enough to create vulnerability. Because systems do not collapse at their weakest point. They collapse when their complexity exceeds their capacity to manage it. And Egypt, now more expansive and interconnected than ever before, is approaching that threshold. The fortresses still stand, the trade routes still function, the administration still operates. But the margin for error is shrinking. And beyond Egypt's borders, new forces are gathering. Forces that have been watching, learning, and waiting. When they arrive, they will not come as traders or neighbors. They will come as rulers. And Egypt will once again face a transformation it did not choose. The system does not collapse all at once. It loosens, then fragments. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, the balance that once defined Egypt begins to slip. Authority at the center weakens. Succession becomes uncertain. Administrative control, stretched across expanding territory, begins to falter. And in that moment of vulnerability, something new enters the story. Not from within, but from beyond Egypt's borders. These new arrivals are known as the Hyksos, a term later Egyptians would use to describe foreign rulers. They are not a single invading army sweeping in from afar. They are a mix of peoples from the Near East who gradually move into the Nile Delta over time, first as traders, settlers, and migrants, and then, eventually, as something more powerful. Because Egypt, now more open and interconnected than in earlier periods, has allowed new populations to settle within its northern regions. At first, this is not seen as a threat. Integration had worked before. Trade had brought prosperity. Foreign presence was not new, but as central authority weakens, these groups begin to consolidate their own power independently of the Egyptian state. And in Lower Egypt, that power takes shape. The Hyksos establish control over the Nile Delta, setting up their capital at Avaris. From there, they rule as kings, not merely local leaders, but a rival authority to the Egyptian system. They adopt certain Egyptian customs, use elements of its administration, and present themselves as legitimate rulers, but they remain distinct. This is something Egypt has never experienced before. Foreign rule within its own land. At the same time, Upper Egypt does not fall under Hyksos control. In the south, Egyptian rulers based in Thebes maintain their own authority. They are weaker than the great pharaohs of the past, but they are not defeated. Instead, Egypt becomes divided once again, not just between regions, but between cultures. The north ruled by the Hyksos. The south ruled by Egyptian kings. Between them lies tension. Not constant war, but an uneasy coexistence. Trade continues between the regions, communication exists, but the division is real and it reshapes Egyptian identity. Because for the first time, Egypt must define itself in contrast to an external ruler within its borders. The Hyksos bring with them technologies and practices that Egypt had not fully adopted before. Most notably, the horse and chariot. This changes warfare entirely. Speed, mobility, and new forms of combat begin to appear in the Nile Valley. The Hyksos also introduce composite bows, new metallurgy techniques, and different approaches to fortification. These innovations give them a significant military advantage, at least initially. Egypt, accustomed to its own methods of warfare and defense, is forced to adapt. And adaptation takes time. During this period, Egyptian rulers in the south observe, learn, and begin to reorganize. They do not immediately challenge Hyksos power. Instead, they strengthen their own position, preparing for a future conflict that is becoming increasingly inevitable. Meanwhile, the presence of foreign rulers has a profound psychological impact. The idea that Egypt, once unified, stable, and dominant, can be ruled by outsiders challenges the entire concept of kingship and divine order. If the pharaoh is meant to maintain Ma'at, how can foreign kings hold power in the land? This is not just a political crisis. It is a cultural one, and it begins to reshape how Egyptians think about themselves. Identity becomes sharper, the distinction between Egyptian and foreign becomes more pronounced, and with that distinction comes a new sense of purpose, the desire not just to rule, but to reclaim. In Upper Egypt, this desire begins to take form. The Theban rulers, though limited in power, start to consolidate their authority. They strengthen their military. They adopt new technologies, including those introduced by the Hyksos. They prepare quietly but deliberately. Because they understand something crucial. To defeat the Hyksos, they must first become as strong as them. And eventually, the moment comes. Conflict between the northern and southern kingdoms intensifies. Skirmishes become campaigns. Campaigns become war. The Theban rulers, now better equipped and more organized, begin to push northward. This is no longer coexistence. It is confrontation. The struggle is long and difficult. The Hyksos are not easily defeated. They have established strong defenses and control key regions, but the momentum begins to shift. Under the leadership of rulers like Seqenenetau and later Ahmose, the Egyptian forces gain ground. They adapt their strategies. They refine their use of chariots and new weapons, and slowly they begin to reclaim territory. The final phase of this conflict culminates in the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt. Avaris falls. The Northern Kingdom is retaken, and for the second time in its history, Egypt is unified again. But this unification is different, because it is born not just from internal consolidation, but from resistance. The experience of foreign rule has transformed Egypt. It has introduced new technologies, new military strategies, and a new understanding of the outside world. It has also created a sense of identity defined in contrast to external forces. And most importantly, it has changed how Egypt sees power. No longer is isolation enough. No longer is internal stability sufficient. If Egypt is to remain secure, it must look beyond its borders. It must project strength, not just within, but outward. And from that realization, a new era begins. An era not of recovery, but of empire. The expulsion of the Hyksos does not return Egypt to what it once was. It transforms it. For the first time in its history, Egypt has experienced foreign rule within its own borders and survived. But survival is not enough. The lesson of the Second Intermediate Period is clear. Isolation invites vulnerability. If Egypt is to remain secure, it cannot simply defend itself. It must dominate. And from that realization, the new kingdom is born. Under the leadership of Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty, Egypt does more than reunify. It reorganizes itself into something fundamentally different, a militarized, outward-looking state capable of projecting power far beyond the Nile Valley. This is no longer just a civilization. It is becoming an empire. The first step in this transformation is the restructuring of the military. Egypt adopts and refines the technologies introduced by the Hyksos. The horse-drawn chariot becomes central to warfare, offering speed and mobility never before possible. Composite bows increase range and power. New training systems create a more professional, disciplined force. The army is no longer a temporary mobilization of farmers. It becomes a permanent institution. This shift changes everything. Because with a standing military, Egypt can act beyond its borders, not just in response to threats, but proactively. Campaigns are launched into Nubia to the south, reasserting control over resource-rich regions. Fortifications are strengthened, trade routes are secured. But the most significant expansion begins in the northeast. Egypt moves into the Levant. This region, connecting Africa to Asia, is not just valuable for trade. It is strategic. It serves as a buffer zone, a frontier where potential threats can be controlled before they reach the Nile. Under rulers like Ahmose and his successors, Egypt establishes influence over key cities and territories. This is a new form of power. Not just control of land, but control of regions beyond the core. At the same time, the role of the pharaoh evolves. He is still divine, still the guardian of Maat, but now he is also a warrior, a leader who commands armies, leads campaigns, and embodies strength in both the spiritual and physical worlds. This dual identity becomes central to New Kingdom ideology. The pharaoh is no longer distant. He is visible, active, present on the battlefield. And this visibility strengthens authority. Because power that is seen is believed. Religion during this period also expands and adapts. The god Ammon, centered in Thebes, rises to prominence. Combined with the solar deity Ra, he becomes Ammon-Ra, a powerful symbol of both hidden and visible forces. Temples dedicated to Ammon grow in size and influence, particularly at Karnak, which becomes one of the most important religious centers in Egypt. The priesthood gains power alongside the state. And this creates a new dynamic. Because while the pharaoh remains supreme, the growing influence of temple institutions introduces another layer of authority within society. Religion and governance are still deeply connected, but the balance between them becomes more complex. Culturally, the New Kingdom enters a period of confidence. Art becomes more elaborate. Architecture expands beyond tombs into massive temple complexes. Foreign influences begin to appear, reflecting Egypt's increasing interaction with other civilizations. Trade brings new materials, new styles, and new ideas into the Nile Valley. Egypt is no longer inward-looking. It is part of a broader world, and it knows it. But expansion brings its own challenges. Maintaining control over distant territories requires constant effort. Garrisons must be supplied, local rulers must be managed, rebellions must be suppressed. The system must operate not just within Egypt, but across regions with different cultures, languages, and political structures. This is the reality of empire, and it demands strength, consistency, and adaptation. Early New Kingdom rulers meet this challenge with success. Campaigns are organized with precision. Administration extends into conquered territories. Egypt establishes itself as a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean and northeastern Africa. Its influence spreads through both military presence and diplomatic relationships. But even in this moment of rising power, the seeds of future complexity are already present. Because the more Egypt expands, the more it must manage. The more it integrates, the more it must balance. And the more it projects power, the more it becomes entangled in the dynamics of a wider world. For now, the momentum is forward. Egypt has moved beyond recovery. It has embraced expansion. And it stands at the beginning of its most powerful era, a time when its armies will march across continents, its rulers will shape international politics, and its civilization will reach heights never before imagined. The age of empire has begun. With the new kingdom fully established, Egypt steps into a phase of history defined not by survival or recovery, but by projection of power on a scale it had never attempted before. This is the age of empire. And at its center stand the warrior pharaohs, rulers who do not only govern from temples and palaces, but lead campaigns, command armies, and actively shape the political landscape of the ancient world. One of the most defining figures of this era is Thutmose III. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, his reign represents the peak of Egyptian military expansion. Through a series of carefully planned campaigns, he extends Egyptian influence deep into the Levant, securing cities, controlling trade routes, and establishing Egypt as the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean world. But his success is not based on brute force alone. It is based on logistics, intelligence, and administration. Egyptian campaigns during this period are highly organized. Armies move along established routes, supported by supply chains and fortified positions. Conquered territories are not simply destroyed, they are integrated. Local rulers are often retained under Egyptian oversight, creating a system of indirect control that allows the empire to expand without constant direct occupation. This is imperial governance in its early form. Control through structure, not constant force. At the same time, Egypt's southern frontier in Nubia becomes increasingly integrated into the empire. Gold mines, trade routes, and local populations are brought under tighter Egyptian administration. Fortresses built in earlier periods now function as fully operational imperial centers. Egypt is no longer just a kingdom along the Nile. It is a network of controlled regions stretching across northeast Africa and into Western Asia. And with this expansion comes immense wealth. Tribute flows into Egypt from conquered regions. Luxury goods arrive from foreign lands. Gold, timber, copper, and exotic materials fuel both the economy and the symbolic power of the state. Temples grow richer. The elite becomes more powerful, and the pharaoh's image becomes more divine than ever before. This wealth is not only economic. It is ideological. Because in Egyptian thought, prosperity is a sign of cosmic order. The success of the empire is seen as evidence that Ma'at, universal balance, is being maintained on a global scale. And the pharaoh is its instrument. Temples during this period reach unprecedented levels of grandeur. Karnak, in particular, becomes a vast religious complex, expanded continuously by successive rulers. Columns rise like forests of stone. Reliefs cover walls with depictions of divine legitimacy, military victory, and cosmic order. Architecture becomes propaganda, but also theology, because in Egypt there is no clear boundary between the two. Under later rulers such as Amenhotep III, the empire reaches a period of extraordinary stability and cultural flourishing. This is not a time of constant warfare, but of consolidation. Diplomacy becomes increasingly important. Egypt engages in correspondence with other great powers of the ancient Near East, including the Mitanni, Hittites, and Babylonian kingdoms. The world is no longer fragmented. It is interconnected, and Egypt sits at its center. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence from this period, reveal a complex system of international relations. Kings address each other as equals in some contexts, while carefully navigating hierarchy in others. Marriage alliances, trade agreements, and political negotiations all form part of this emerging diplomatic system. Egypt is not just dominating the world. It is participating in it. But beneath this outward stability, internal tensions begin to surface. The immense power of the priesthood of Amen continues to grow, particularly in Thebes. Wealth flows into temples, sometimes rivaling the resources of the state itself. This creates a subtle but important imbalance between religious and royal authority. At the same time, the costs of empire increase. Maintaining distant territories requires constant attention. Rebellions in conquered regions must be suppressed. Alliances must be maintained. Borders must be defended. The administrative system becomes increasingly complex, and with complexity comes vulnerability. Because empires do not collapse only from external attack. They weaken through internal strain. And as the new kingdom reaches its peak, that strain begins to appear. A major transformation is on the horizon. One that will not simply adjust the system, but attempt to redefine it entirely. A moment where religion, politics, and identity will collide in a way that challenges the very structure of Egyptian civilization. And when it comes, Egypt will not remain unchanged. Empires do not only change through war or economics or expansion. Sometimes they change from within. And in Egypt's new kingdom, that internal shock arrives in the form of a single ruler who attempts something unprecedented, to reshape the entire spiritual foundation of civilization itself. His name is Akhenaten, and his reign marks one of the most radical transformations in Egyptian history. At first, he is known as Amenhotep IV, a traditional pharaoh in a traditional system. Egypt is stable, powerful, and deeply tied to its established religious order, especially the cult of Amen, whose influence has grown immensely through the temple system centered in Thebes. But something changes. Whether driven by personal conviction, political strategy, or a combination of both, Akhenaten turns away from the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods and elevates a single deity above all others, the Aten, represented as the sun disk. This is not a subtle shift. It is a rupture. For the first time in Egypt's long history, the complex and layered system of gods, central to its identity, politics, and cosmic understanding, is replaced by a form of near-monotheistic worship. And this change is not just theological. It is political. Because the traditional priesthood of Amen is one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt, it controls vast wealth, land, and influence across the kingdom. By elevating the Aten and diminishing other cults, Akhenaten directly challenges this entrenched power structure. The result is a confrontation not just between ideas, but between institutions. To reinforce this new religious order, Akhenaten makes another radical decision. He abandons Thebes and establishes a new capital at Akhetaten, later known as Amarna. This city is built rapidly, designed specifically for the worship of the Aten. Temples are open to the sunlight, unlike the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of traditional Egyptian religion. The art of this period also changes dramatically, becoming more naturalistic, more intimate, and often deeply personal. For a brief moment, Egyptian civilization looks different. Not just in belief, but in expression. Akhenaten himself is depicted in unusual ways, elongated features, softer forms, and family scenes that emphasize his relationship with his wife Nefertiti and their children. These artistic choices break sharply from traditional Egyptian conventions, which emphasized idealized and rigid forms. But beneath this transformation lies deep instability. Because revolutions in belief systems are never isolated. They disrupt everything connected to them. The traditional priesthood loses influence. Administrative systems are forced to adapt. Regional authorities become uncertain, and Egypt's external territories begin to experience less direct oversight as attention shifts inward toward religious reform. The empire does not collapse immediately, but it begins to loosen. And abroad, Egypt's rivals are watching. Messages from foreign kings during this period suggest frustration and confusion. Alliances weaken. Territories in the Levant become harder to control. The carefully maintained imperial network begins to show signs of strain. Because while Akhenaten focuses on spiritual transformation, the practical machinery of empire requires constant attention. And neglect has consequences. After Akhenaten's death, his reforms are quickly dismantled. His successors, including Tutankhamun, restore traditional religious practices. The worship of Ammon and the broader pantheon returns. The capital moves back to Thebes. Akhetaten is abandoned, and the religious revolution is systematically reversed. It is as if Egypt is attempting to erase the experiment entirely. But history does not erase easily. The Amarna period leaves behind lasting effects in art, in politics, and in the memory of Egyptian civilization. It reveals both the flexibility and the fragility of the system. A single ruler in a highly centralized state can reshape the ideological foundation of an entire culture. But it also shows something else, that such transformation cannot easily endure without institutional support. And so Egypt returns to tradition. But it does so changed. Because once a system has been questioned from within, it cannot return to innocence. The new kingdom continues after this period, but it is no longer in its purest form. The balance between religion, politics, and empire has been tested and permanently altered. And as time moves forward, new pressures begin to emerge from beyond Egypt's borders once again. Pressures that will not come from internal reform, but from external forces growing stronger in the wider ancient world. And this time, the challenges will be larger than anything Egypt has faced before. After the Amarna experiment is dismantled, Egypt does not return to simplicity. It returns to tradition, but not to stability. The new kingdom continues, yet something fundamental has shifted. The centralized confidence of earlier dynasties begins to show strain. The empire is still vast, still wealthy, still influential, but it is no longer effortless to maintain. Power must now be managed, not simply exercised. Successive rulers restore the old religious order, especially the dominance of Ammon and the priesthood at Thebes. Temples regain their authority. Ritual life returns to familiar patterns. The memory of Akhenaten's revolution is carefully minimized, almost erased from official history. But the consequences remain, because Egypt has seen how quickly its foundations can be challenged from within. And that knowledge changes everything. Externally, the geopolitical world is also shifting. The great powers of the ancient Near East, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mitanni remnants, and rising Assyrian influence are becoming more organized, more militarized, and more competitive. Egypt is no longer the uncontested center of its world. It is one power among several. And that changes the nature of diplomacy. Treaties become more formal, rivalries become more structured, warfare becomes more frequent and more technologically advanced. The famous Battle of Kadesh between Egypt and the Hittites under Ramesses II reflects this new reality, a clash between two imperial systems competing for dominance in the Levant. Neither side achieves total victory. Instead, the battle ends in one of history's earliest known peace treaties. This is significant because it shows that Egypt is now operating in a world where equilibrium between powers is sometimes preferable to total conquest. The empire adapts, not by expanding endlessly, but by managing balance through diplomacy as well as force. But internally, pressures continue to grow. The wealth generated by empire does not distribute evenly. Temples accumulate vast resources. The priesthood of Ammon becomes one of the most powerful institutions in the country, rivaling even royal authority in some regions. This creates a subtle but important shift in power dynamics. The pharaoh is still divine, but he is no longer the only center of influence. At the same time, maintaining distant territories becomes increasingly difficult. In the Levant, Egyptian control weakens as local powers assert themselves. Garrisons require constant support, trade routes must be defended, rebellions must be suppressed. The cost of empire rises, and with it, the strain on the state increases. In Nubia, Egypt remains more stable, maintaining long-standing control over gold resources and trade networks. But even here, the administrative burden is significant. The system requires constant attention, coordination, and resources. Empire is no longer expansion. It is maintenance. And maintenance is exhausting. By the time of the later 20th dynasty, particularly under rulers like Ramesses III, Egypt faces a new kind of threat, not just rival empires, but large-scale population movements and invasions from the sea and land routes. These groups, often referred to collectively in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, represent a destabilizing force across the eastern Mediterranean. They disrupt trade, challenge coastal regions, and contribute to widespread upheaval in neighboring civilizations. Egypt manages to repel these invasions, but at great cost. Military campaigns drain resources, defensive efforts strain the economy, and while Egypt survives, it does so in a world that is becoming increasingly unstable. Internally, the strain becomes more visible. Corruption appears in administrative systems. Workers at royal tomb sites strike for the first recorded time in history, demanding food and payment. This is a striking sign, not just of economic pressure, but of social awareness and organized labor resistance within the system itself. Even the sacred realm of royal burial is no longer immune to disruption. The illusion of effortless divine order is fading. And as the new kingdom continues, the balance between central authority and institutional power becomes more fragile. Pharaohs still rule. Temples still function. The empire still exists. But the system is no longer expanding. It is holding. And holding is always temporary. Because in history, long-term stability is rarely static. It is either renewed through adaptation or broken by accumulated pressure. Egypt is approaching that threshold once again. The world around it is changing faster than its internal systems can fully adjust to. And within its own borders, power is beginning to disperse in ways that cannot easily be reversed. What comes next will not be a simple continuation of empire. It will be a transition into fragmentation, decline, and eventual transformation into something entirely different. The age of pharaohs is not ending yet, but it is beginning to lose its certainty. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They weaken slowly, unevenly, across generations. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt still looks like an empire on paper. Temples stand, pharaohs rule, the Nile still brings life to the valley, but beneath that surface, the structure that once held everything together is loosening. The first signs are administrative. Central authority becomes less effective at controlling distant regions. Governors in Upper Egypt, especially around Thebes, begin to act with increasing independence. In the north, control over the delta becomes more difficult to enforce consistently. Communication slows, orders are delayed, enforcement becomes uneven. Egypt is still one state, but it is behaving more like many. And that shift is critical, because empire depends not just on territory, but on coordination. When coordination weakens, authority fragments into local centers of power. At the same time, the priesthood, particularly the priests of Ammon, grows even more influential. Over time, they accumulate vast landholdings, economic resources, and political leverage. In some periods, their authority in Thebes rivals that of the pharaoh himself. This creates a dual structure of power. Royal authority in theory, temple authority in practice. And when power splits like this, stability becomes fragile. Economically, Egypt begins to feel strain as well. Maintaining the military presence required for empire is expensive. Distant territories in the Levant become harder to control. Tribute flows become less reliable. Trade networks face disruption from instability across the broader Eastern Mediterranean world. Even Egypt's victories in this period feel more defensive than expansive. The empire is no longer pushing outward. It is holding inward. And holding is expensive. One of the clearest signs of internal strain appears in labor systems. At Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who built royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, workers staged documented strikes due to delayed or insufficient rations. This is one of the earliest recorded labor protests in human history. It reveals something important. The system is no longer seamlessly functioning. Even those closest to the pharaonic center are feeling instability. Meanwhile, external pressures continue to grow. The Sea Peoples, along with other migrating groups across the Mediterranean, destabilize neighboring civilizations. The Hittite Empire collapses, trade routes become unpredictable, entire city-states in the Levant disappear or are severely weakened. Egypt survives this wave of upheaval. But survival comes at a cost. Continuous military engagement drains resources. Border defenses require constant reinforcement. The state must respond repeatedly to crises that originate outside its control. And over time, exhaustion sets in. By the end of the 20th dynasty, royal authority becomes increasingly symbolic. Pharaohs still reign, but their ability to enforce control across Egypt weakens significantly. Regional leaders and temple institutions take on more responsibility for local governance. The unity of Egypt becomes more theoretical than practical. And then the political structure begins to fracture openly. The power of the high priest of Ammon in Thebes grows to such an extent that it effectively forms a parallel authority in Upper Egypt. In the north, different rulers emerge in the Delta region. Egypt is no longer a single coherent state, but a collection of overlapping powers. This is not sudden collapse. It is decomposition, a slow redistribution of authority away from the center. By the time the Third Intermediate Period begins, Egypt has entered a new political reality. The pharaonic system still exists, but it is divided among competing dynasties. Kings rule in different regions simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy. Unity, once restored so many times before, is now fractured again. But unlike earlier collapses, this one feels more permanent. Because the structures that once allowed rapid reunification, strong centralized bureaucracy, uncontested royal authority, and unified economic control, are no longer fully intact. Egypt is still Egypt, but it is no longer one Egypt. And yet, even in fragmentation, the cultural identity of Egypt remains remarkably persistent. Religion, language, artistic tradition, and historical memory continue to bind the civilization together even when political unity is gone. This is one of Egypt's most enduring characteristics. Its ability to remain culturally continuous even when politically divided. But over time, even cultural unity is tested by new forces emerging beyond Egypt's borders. Assyrian power rises in the Near East. Libyan groups settle and integrate into Egyptian regions. Nubian kingdoms grow stronger in the south, eventually becoming powerful enough to influence or even control parts of Egypt itself. The center of gravity is shifting, and Egypt, once the dominant force of its world, is increasingly responding to external dynamics rather than shaping them. The age of uncontested empire is over. What remains is a civilization trying to preserve identity in a world that is no longer under its control. And from this fragmented landscape, new powers will eventually emerge to attempt reunification once again. But they will not inherit the same world. They will inherit a changed Egypt, a civilization still alive, but no longer whole. Egypt does not disappear. It disperses. By the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, the idea of a single, unified pharaonic state still exists, but it no longer matches political reality. Power is split across multiple centers, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling different regions of the Nile Valley. In the north, rulers based in the delta govern with increasing autonomy. In the south, Thebes remains a powerful religious and cultural center, dominated heavily by the priesthood of Ammon. And further south, Nubian influence continues to grow, slowly reshaping the political balance of the entire region. What was once centralized empire is now layered authority, overlapping, competing, and unstable. The pharaoh still exists, but the role has changed dramatically. In many cases, kings rule only parts of Egypt, while other regions recognize different dynasties or local authorities. Some rulers focus on ceremonial legitimacy, while real power is held by military leaders or temple institutions. The concept of kingship remains sacred, but its execution becomes fragmented. This is one of the most complex periods in Egyptian history because it is not defined by a single collapse, but by a long process of political decentralization. Authority shifts gradually from the royal center into regional hands, especially into the control of powerful families and religious institutions. The priesthood of Ammon in Thebes becomes particularly influential. At times, the high priest effectively governs Upper Egypt, controlling resources, managing administration, and even influencing royal succession. This creates a system where religious authority and political authority are deeply intertwined and sometimes indistinguishable. Meanwhile, in the north, new dynasties emerge, often with Libyan origins. These rulers integrate into Egyptian society over generations, adopting Egyptian customs, titles, and religious practices while maintaining distinct regional power bases. This is not invasion in the traditional sense. It is assimilation through fragmentation. And over time, it reshapes the identity of rulership itself. In this environment, Egypt becomes less of a unified state and more of a cultural political network. Shared traditions still bind it together: language, religion, art, and memory, but political control is divided among multiple competing authorities. And yet, something important remains constant. The Nile still functions as the backbone of civilization. Agriculture continues, trade persists, temples remain active. Even in political fragmentation, the daily rhythms of Egyptian life maintain a surprising level of continuity. This continuity is one of the most important reasons Egypt endures through repeated cycles of collapse and reunification. Because while governments fall, civilization persists. However, external pressures continue to increase. To the south, the kingdom of Kush in Nubia grows stronger, eventually developing its own powerful state centered at Napata. These Nubian rulers are deeply influenced by Egyptian culture, religion, and political systems, but they are no longer subordinate. In fact, they begin to project power northward. To the northeast, Assyrian power continues to expand aggressively across the Near East, reshaping trade routes, military alliances, and regional stability. Egypt is no longer the dominant force it once was. It is now one of several competing civilizations in a volatile international system. Internally, fragmentation creates both flexibility and weakness. Local rulers can respond more quickly to regional conditions. Temples maintain stability in their domains, but there is no longer a unified strategy for Egypt as a whole. Coordination is limited, defense is inconsistent, and long-term planning becomes increasingly difficult. The result is a civilization that is still functioning, but no longer synchronized. Over time, this fragmentation opens the door for external intervention. And that intervention comes from a power that has been expanding steadily for centuries. The Assyrian Empire. With advanced military organization, iron weaponry, and highly centralized administration, the Assyrians begin to extend their influence into the Levant and eventually into Egypt itself. Unlike earlier interactions, this is not just trade or diplomacy. It is domination. Egypt, divided internally, struggles to resist effectively. Different regions respond differently, some resisting, others collaborating, others falling under direct control. For the first time in its long history, Egypt becomes a contested territory between multiple external and internal powers simultaneously. And the symbolic meaning of kingship continues to shift. Pharaohs still exist, but their authority is increasingly conditional, dependent on alliances, military strength, and regional control rather than unquestioned divine unity. The image of a single, all-powerful ruler of a unified Egypt is fading into memory. In its place is a more complex reality, a civilization defined not by unity, but by persistence through division. And yet, even as political fragmentation deepens, Egyptian identity does not disappear. It adapts. It survives through religion, language, cultural continuity, and the enduring authority of tradition. Because even when Egypt is divided, it remains Egypt. And from this fragmented landscape, new forces are already beginning to shape the next transformation, one that will not be led solely by native dynasties, but by foreign rulers who adopt Egypt's identity to govern it. A final shift is approaching, one that will redefine what it means to be Egyptian in a world no longer ruled exclusively by Egyptians. By the time Egypt enters the late period, its long history has become something like a memory written over itself again and again. Dynasties rise and fall, capitals shift, authority fragments and recombines, and yet the civilization continues, held together by something deeper than politics, a shared cultural and religious identity that refuses to disappear. But politically, Egypt is no longer self-contained. It is increasingly shaped by foreign influence. In the south, the kingdom of Kush reasserts itself in a powerful way. The Nubian rulers of Napata are no longer just neighbors, they are conquerors. Drawing heavily on Egyptian religion, royal ideology, and artistic tradition, they see themselves not as outsiders, but as restorers of true Egyptian order. This leads to a remarkable moment in history. The 25th dynasty. Often called the Nubian dynasty, it represents a reversal of expectations. Foreign-born rulers take control of Egypt, but they do so by embracing Egyptian identity. They restore temples, revive religious traditions, and present themselves as legitimate pharaohs in the full traditional sense. Egyptian culture does not vanish under their rule. It is reactivated. But this restoration is not permanent, because Egypt is now part of a much larger geopolitical struggle. To the north and east, the Assyrian Empire is expanding aggressively. It is one of the most powerful and militarized states in the ancient world, built on centralized authority, professional armies, and ruthless expansion. As Assyria pushes westward into the Levant, Egypt becomes entangled in its imperial system. Conflict becomes inevitable. Assyrian campaigns eventually reach Egypt itself, challenging the Nubian-controlled dynasty. The result is a series of invasions and counter-invasions that weaken Egyptian control over its own territory. Major cities are sacked. Political authority shifts rapidly between rival factions. And for a time, Egypt is directly controlled by foreign powers. Assyrian dominance marks one of the most destabilizing moments in Egyptian history. Although not a complete occupation of the entire country, it significantly undermines centralized authority and exposes the limits of Egypt's ability to resist large-scale imperial warfare from outside its traditional sphere. But even this does not erase Egypt. Instead, it reshapes it again. After Assyrian power begins to decline, Egypt experiences a brief resurgence under native rulers of the 26th dynasty, often centered in the city of Sais. This period, sometimes called the Sate Renaissance, represents an attempt to restore Egyptian independence and cultural identity. Temples are rebuilt, art is revived in traditional styles, administrative systems are reorganized. There is a deliberate effort to look backward to the Old Kingdom, to the New Kingdom, as sources of legitimacy and inspiration. But the world around Egypt has changed. Mediterranean powers are now more interconnected than ever. Greek traders, mercenaries, and settlers begin to appear in increasing numbers. Egypt is no longer at the center of the ancient world. It is one participant in a growing network of civilizations across the Mediterranean basin. And that network is becoming more competitive. Persian power rises in the east. The Achaemenid Empire, highly organized and expansive, eventually moves into Egypt as part of its broader imperial structure. Unlike earlier periods of foreign influence, Persian control is more systematic and bureaucratic. Egypt becomes a province within a vast empire. Yet even under Persian rule, Egyptian identity persists. Local traditions continue. Religious practices remain intact. Temples still function. The pharaonic system is adapted, not erased. Persian rulers often present themselves in Egyptian form when governing the region, adopting titles and symbols to legitimize their authority. This is a recurring pattern in Egypt's later history. Foreign rulers do not simply replace Egyptian identity. They absorb it. Because Egypt is not just a territory. It is a civilization with deep institutional memory, one that can outlast political systems through cultural continuity. But the cycle of foreign domination and brief native resurgence does not stabilize. It continues to shift with the rise and fall of empires beyond Egypt's borders. And over time, a new kind of power begins to emerge from the Mediterranean world. One that will not only conquer Egypt militarily, but integrate it into an entirely new cultural and political system. A system that will redefine Egypt once again, not as an independent empire, but as part of a wider Hellenistic world. The age of pharaohs is approaching its final transformation. And the next ruler of Egypt will not come from the Nile Valley alone.